Two House Homeland Security subcommittees held a joint hearing on how FEMA contracts are awarded and managed. Members asked officials from FEMA, Homeland Security, and the General Accounting Office about a $30 million contract to provide Puerto Rico with tarps after Hurricane Maria, which were never delivered.
Seeing that we have a quorum, the Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. The committee is meeting today to receive testimony on FEMA's contracting, reviewing lessons learned from past disasters to improve preparedness. Turn the page. I'd like to thank Chairwoman Torres Small and Ranking Member Crenshaw of the Oversight, Management, and Accountability Subcommittee for coming together with Ranking Member King and me to hold this hearing. I would also like to thank the witnesses for being here today to discuss disaster contracting. This week is Hurricane Preparedness Week, and today marks 22 days until the 2019 hurricane season begins. Unfortunately, there are still real questions about FEMA's preparedness for disasters, not the least of which is that there is not a confirmed administrator at the helm of FEMA. I am particularly concerned about FEMA's contracting for disasters. Proper disaster contracting is crucial to the successful response efforts, as disaster contracts provide for several survival and comfort items like food, water, blankets, and cots that communities need following a major devastation. Disaster contracts also provide for important response-related services like debris removal, translators, and housing inspectors. While the magnitude of the effects of hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, and the like are obvious, FEMA seems to continually fall short in the realm of disaster contracting. From Hurricane Katrina, we learned that one of the most important aspects of disaster preparedness is advanced contracting. However, here we are 14 years after Katrina, and the Government Accountability Office noted that its December 2018 report, GAO 19-93, on 2017 disaster contracting, that FEMA still needs to improve its advanced contracting practices. Specifically, the GAO found that the advanced contracts FEMA had in place prior to the 2017 hurricane season were not sufficient to cover the need, the absence of which caused FEMA to scramble to enter into post-disaster contracts. Simply put, there needs to be more contracts in place before a disaster strikes. While it's difficult to predict exact needs prior to disasters, we do know that hurricane season is every June 1 to November 30th, and history has shown us, that FEMA is likely to be underprepared in some fashion. From a recent April 2019 GAO report, GAO 19-281, we also know that FEMA is still struggling with acquiring and retaining its disaster contracting workforce. The absence of adequate staffing levels causes undue delays in the screening and delivery of important goods and services impacted communities following a disaster. Then there are instances in the 2017, such as the failed Bronze Star and Tribute contracts from FEMA. In the case of the Bronze Star contract, deficiencies in FEMA's contract procedures resulted in delayed delivery of crucial supplies that would have helped Puerto Ricans protect their homes from further damage after the Hurricane Maria. Similarly, the tribute contract was for $30 million emergency meals, and it had to be canceled after tribute only delivered 50,000 of the 30 million meals required. These types of contracting areas are troubling and have major consequences. We need to have an honest conversation today about how FEMA should proceed with preventing future contracting missteps, the results of which are Americans going without emergency goods and services. When a disaster strikes, the American people depend on the federal government to get it right. Yet, as the GAO has reported, FEMA's disaster contracting apparatus is unprepared and its disaster contract workforce is overwhelmed and overworked. FEMA itself also has acknowledged its contracting workforce shortcomings as evidenced in their 2017 hurricane season after action report. To make matters worse, the president has again proposed to cuts to the agency's discretionary funding, further complicating FEMA's ability to address disasters contracting workforce challenges. Furthermore, the recent federal government shutdown, roughly 6 months before the start of hurricane season, caused FEMA to order a stop on outstanding contracts, causing the agency to lose valuable disaster contracting preparation time. Emergency preparedness, response, and recovery is too important of mission for this agency to consistently struggle with disaster contracting. Having experienced the horrors disasters can cause a community with Hurricane Sandy, I know how critical it is for FEMA to have effective processes in place before a disaster strikes. With this, I look forward to engaging with DHS Office of Inspector General and the GAO about underlining issues that they have identified that seem to chronically cause FEMA to miss the mark with disaster contracting. I also look forward to hearing from FEMA about what Congress can do to help the agency improve its disaster contracting. With that, I now recognize the ranking member of Emergency Preparedness, Response and Recovery Subcommittee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. King, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing, and thank you for calling it and working with our colleagues on this with the two subcommittees. In 2012, Superstorm Sandy wreaked havoc on the states of New York and New Jersey, as you well know, and as well as 10 other states, resulting in around 150 deaths, hundreds of thousands of impacted residents, and over $65 billion in damages. The storm's effects were widespread and extensive, with substantial flooding, massive power outages, and fuel shortages in parts of the region. Following Hurricane Sandy, FEMA released an after-action report detailing successes, lessons learned, and areas of needed improvement in hurricane recovery efforts. One area highlighted for improvement was reducing the complexity of the public assistance program. FEMA's Public Assistance Grant Program provides federal assistance to state, local, tribal, and certain private nonprofit organizations following a presidential major disaster declaration. While FEMA did take several steps to help government officials better understand this program and reduce the complexity of rules, state and local officials continue to express confusion regarding the program and lack of clarity delayed recovery efforts. The Sandy Recovery Improvement Act of 2013 improved the public assistance program by providing alternative procedures to allow for flexibility for recovery projects that encourage timely and cost-effective completion. These alternative procedures rely on fixed cost estimates that allow recipients or subrecipients to use remaining funds for other eligible purposes if the cost of the project is below the estimate. FEMA's Hurricane Sandy After Action Report noted that the new public assistance program can, quote, serve as a springboard for FEMA to continue reducing the complexity of the PA program. However, according to the DHS Office of Inspector General, FEMA continues to fail in overseeing grant recipients' effective management of disaster relief grants, which poses potential financial risks to taxpayers. The GAO has reported on FEMA's need for better management of its advanced contract program. Advanced contracts for goods and services enable the government to quickly and effectively mobilize resources in the aftermath of a disaster. Among other recommendations, GAO recommends that FEMA update its strategy for advanced contracts to provide clear guidance on the use and prioritization of such contracts so they can quickly and cost-effectively provide goods and services to disaster-stricken areas. Delays in response and recovery efforts due to a lack of coordination and inconsistent information are not acceptable. Following major disasters, advanced and post-disaster federal contracts and assistance are essential to rebuilding our nation's communities. It is imperative that FEMA continues to streamline its efforts to ensure proper oversight, improve coordination, and maintain its focus on survivors and their recovery needs. And, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. I want to thank them for being here, and how to improve FEMA contracting mechanisms so the response and recovery efforts are timely and effective following catastrophic disasters and emergencies. And I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. King. I now recognize the chairwoman of the Oversight, Management, and Accountability Subcommittee, the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Torres Small, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Payne, and thanks for the opportunity to co-chair this hearing with you. With the 2019 hurricane season just 3 weeks away, this hearing couldn't be more timely. It is an opportunity to discuss lessons learned from past disasters and assess whether necessary improvements have been made to ready the nation for future events. Disasters can strike with little to no warning. We unfortunately experienced this firsthand in my district in New Mexico when a tornado touched down outside of Dexter this past March. I'd also like to acknowledge those affected by the flooding in Ranking Member Crenshaw's district. These disasters demonstrate that at a moment's notice, FEMA may need to assist thousands of survivors who suddenly have an immediate need for emergency goods and services. FEMA cannot prepare for every eventuality, but as the frequency and severity of natural disasters increase, it is as important as ever that the agency take corrective action to better execute its no-fail mission. Disaster contracting is one area where improvements are most needed. As the witnesses from GAO and the DHS Office of the Inspector General can confirm, FEMA has a checkered history with the disaster response and recovery contracts it awards and oversees. I am glad that some improvements have been made since Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast in 2015. For example, more contracts are being competitively bid, reducing the potential for waste, fraud, and abuse. And more contracts are being awarded to local vendors, stimulating local economies. But challenges remain. FEMA still struggles to utilize advanced contracts. These contracts are awarded prior to a natural disaster when there is not an urgent need for emergency goods and services, which allows FEMA to maximize competition and properly evaluate vendors' qualities. We saw this problem borne out in the response to Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. In multiple instances, FEMA had to cancel contracts it awarded after a hurricane hit, rather than relying on advanced contracts that were in place prior to a storm. Some of the vendors had no business being awarded government contracts. FEMA awarded more than $30 million worth of emergency tarps and sheeting contracts to a company that was formed just weeks before Hurricane Maria struck. It's no surprise that this company failed to deliver. Another firm with one employee and a history of canceled contracts was, for some reason, entrusted to deliver 30 million meals to hurricane survivors in Puerto Rico. Less than a month later, the company only managed to supply 50,000 meals, about 0.1% of what was agreed to. Not surprisingly, FEMA had to cancel this contract too. If FEMA had had more advanced contracts in place or a better process for vetting vendors after a hurricane hit, some of these mistakes could have been avoided. FEMA must also do a better job of overseeing disaster contracts awarded by state and local governments. As the Inspector General has reported, local emergency managers, some of whom may be dealing with a disaster for the first time, need guidance and training from FEMA on how to follow federal procurement regulations. At the end of the day, it's federal tax dollars that are on the line. As the chair of our Oversight, Management, and Accountability Subcommittee, I'm also concerned about FEMA's ability to recruit and retain qualified contracting officers. I understand that, as of January, more than 1/3 of the positions within FEMA's office and the Chief Procurement Officer were vacant, and the agency has actually lost contracting staff since 2017. This is not the direction we need to be headed. If anything, FEMA needs more contracting officers, not less. And these should be permanent positions, not the short-term hires FEMA is using as a stopgap. Mr. Kamoy, I look forward to learning about the steps you have taken over the past 2 years to assess FEMA's workforce needs and to hire more contracting staff in particular. The agency's procurement office needs to be at full strength as we head into the 2019 hurricane season. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I look forward to a fruitful discussion with all 3 of our witnesses here today.
And thank you, Chairwoman. I now recognize the ranking member of the Oversight and Management Accountability Subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Payne, Ranking Member King, and Chairwoman Torres-Small. It's great to be with all of you, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. Been here long enough to see the range of issues this committee deals with, from countering threats from terrorist activity to cybersecurity to natural disasters. All can be harmful, affect national security, and most importantly, impact the American people. I'm pleased we are holding this hearing today to explore the ways FEMA can improve its contracting. FEMA has one of the most important functions of the federal government in helping our citizens prepare for and recover from disasters. My home state of Texas witnessed the devastation that nature can cause when Hurricane Harvey hit in late August of 2017. It is something my constituents and I saw and dealt with firsthand. That storm brought torrential downpours that caused catastrophic flooding in Houston and many of the areas I represent. Hurricane Harvey cost 107 people their lives and is estimated to have cost $125 billion in damage. The Texans are resilient, and during the storm we evacuated our neighbors with the help of our friends from the Cajun Navy, volunteers from across the country, the Texas National Guard, and the U.S. Coast Guard. As soon as the waters receded, we got to work with recovery. It's been over 600 days, and we are still recovering and rebuilding after the devastation caused by this storm. And while we are grateful for the assistance from FEMA, we must always ask ourselves how we can do better. It is our role to review the activities of federal agencies and determine what we can do better to serve our constituents and the American taxpayer. That is part of our oversight role in Congress and on this committee. While 2017 was an unusual year because of the unprecedented number of disasters, including Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and the California wildfires, FEMA must be prepared for all disasters regardless of their frequency. FEMA assists with disaster recovery utilizing 3 different methods. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, FEMA began using advanced contracts for goods and services it typically needs in a disaster. The agency also provides help after a disaster through post-disaster contracts and public assistance grants. In the 2017 disaster season, many of the post-disaster contracts were for power distribution equipment and food and water. FEMA uses public assistance grants to supplement state and local efforts for things like debris removal and emergency protective measures, as well as projects to repair infrastructure and facilities. Responsible administration of these contracts is vital to helping the victims of a disaster recover and in helping the states and localities recover and rebuild. We need to get these contracts right to ensure that we can adequately address basic needs immediately following a disaster. As we rebuild our communities, we need to ensure that federal funds are not wasted either. We should not be picking winners and losers with these contracts. They need to be entered with the goal of ensuring that everyone wins: the victims, the communities, the contractors, and the taxpayers. FEMA needs to continuously improve its management and oversight of its contracts to ensure that this is the case. While I applaud FEMA for its excellent work in helping rebuild lives and communities after a disaster, we all must recognize that there may be ways to improve its operations. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today on the best ways to add accountability and oversight in the disaster recovery process. I would also like to add that I have a report prepared by the Texas General Land Office on lessons learned from Hurricane Harvey. This is a detailed proposal that I think FEMA should have, and I ask unanimous consent to enter it into the record.
Duly noted.
Yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now it's my honor to recognize the overall chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to our panel of witnesses. I want to thank both you and Chairwoman Torres Small for holding this hearing today, and to the witnesses for being here. Disaster contracting is a central component of disaster preparedness and an issue that I've been following for quite some time. Since Hurricane Katrina exposed gaps in the FEMA's disaster contracting practices in 2005, the agency still has not managed to make the necessary adjustment that facilitates smoother response and recovery efforts and make FEMA a better steward of taxpayers' dollars. Moving into the 2019 hurricane season, I'm concerned that FEMA will fall short in this area once again. To add to my worry, for the last 2 months, FEMA has not had a Senate-confirmed administrator. In the absence of a permanent leadership, FEMA is likely to get even further behind with preparing its disaster contracting initiatives. Contracting is incredibly important to how we as a nation prepare for and respond to disasters. After shortcomings were identified in preparation for and in response to Hurricane Katrina, Congress enacted reforms in 2006 requiring FEMA to establish advanced contracts for goods and services to enable the government to quickly and effectively mobilize resources in the aftermath of a disaster and provide a preference to local businesses in the area affected by a major disaster. But as we will hear today from the DHS, OIG, and the GAO, FEMA has yet to adequately implement all of the reforms, despite it being well over a decade since the law was passed. Having advanced contracts in place before a disaster helps ensure the federal government has the adequate and appropriate resources to respond when a disaster strikes. Without these advanced contracts, the government risks taxpayers' money by spending more than is necessary for goods and services. Or worse, Americans in need might be left waiting as the federal government has to go out and award new contracts in the midst of a disaster. FEMA must do its due diligence to ensure that companies select for advanced contracts can meet the contract terms. The opportunity to bid on advanced contracts must also truly be full and open, with equal consideration being given to small businesses, including minority-owned businesses. In 2017, when responding to the catastrophic hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, FEMA had to cancel multiple contracts due to the agency's failure to weed out inexperienced or unqualified vendors. Some of the vendors had been barred from doing work with other agencies. While I know FEMA claims this did not affect their work on the ground in 2017, common sense tells us that emergency response is improved by having qualified vendors in place to provide goods and services reliably. FEMA has also made post-disaster awards to vendors outside the disaster area without adequate justification, meaning the agency may have missed opportunities to award contracts to local businesses, which could have helped jumpstart disaster-affected local communities. Moreover, FEMA must deal with staffing vacancies in the Office of Procurement, in the Office of Chief Procurement Officer, which as of last summer had over 70 vacant positions. FEMA must not only fill these vacancies, it also needs to ensure its staff is properly trained to conduct the duties assigned to them. We'll talk about it a little later because they've hired new people They hired 13, I think, and 12 have already left. So it continues to be a problem. Let me just say that we want to get it right. FEMA is the last line of defense to help the American people. When all systems fail, FEMA should be there. Congress has been really good in supporting FEMA's mission. They will give them the resources. Now we just need to get it right. So I hope from these reports, Mr. Chairman, that we get an opportunity to continue work on improving FEMA's response. In light of that, I'd also like to suggest that we hold a meeting to discuss contracts governed by Section 428 of the Stafford Act, especially for Puerto Rico recovery. I've made a couple of visits to Puerto Rico, and it just seems like we should be further along than we are. And I want to make sure if there's something we are missing in this process to speed it up, that we fix it. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Other members of the committee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. I'd like to welcome our panel witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Brian Camoy, who serves as Associate Administrator for Mission Support at FEMA. In this role, Mr. Camoy oversees the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer, which is responsible for FEMA's contracting and acquisitions, and the Office of the Chief Component Human Capital Officer, which is responsible for personnel issues at the agency. Prior to joining FEMA in 2013, he served as Senior Director of Preparedness Policy on the White House National Security Council and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Next, we have Ms. Marie Mack, who leads the Government Accountability Office's work on a wide range of issues involving acquisitions, contracting at the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. Ms. Mack has nearly 20 years of service to GAO. She previously worked at the Naval Air Systems Command and U.S. Coast Guard Headquarters. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? Oh, all right. I got one right today. Finally, we are joined by Ms. Kathleen Trimble, Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Audits at the Department of Homeland Security, the Office of Inspector General, where she oversees disaster management and infrastructure protection issues. Prior to joining DHS OIG in 2018, Ms. Trimble worked at GAO for 20 years. She has been responsible for multiple in-depth reviews of major DHS acquisitions and was also involved with GAO's assessment of federal, state, and local responses to Hurricane Katrina. Well, without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Camoy.
Good morning, Chairman Payne and Chairwoman Torres-Small, Ranking Members King and Crenshaw, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Brian Camoy, and I'm the Associate Administrator for Mission Support at FEMA. On behalf of Acting Administrator Gaynor, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today about the agency's disaster contracting program and its key role in achieving FEMA's mission to help people before, during, and after disasters. FEMA's Office of the Chief Procurement Officer manages the agency's contracting needs to handle day-to-day operations and support survivors throughout the disaster response and recovery process. FEMA's procurement team negotiates high-quality, cost-effective, and timely contracts to accomplish FEMA's mission. Since 2016, FEMA has executed more than 32,000 contract actions, resulting in over $10.5 billion in contract obligations. FEMA adheres to and assesses contractors according to the federal acquisition regulations. As part of the acquisition process, contracting officers evaluate proposals and vet potential contractors, including obtaining past performance information. During declared disasters, the federal acquisition regulations and Department of Homeland Security policy give FEMA specific authorities and flexibilities to expedite contracting actions so that our agency and our partners can obtain resources quickly to help survivors. These authorities, such as the unusual and compelling urgency exception in the federal acquisition regulations, help streamline procurement timelines while adhering to applicable federal and agency procedures. Each year, FEMA enters into pre-positioned contracts in advance of disasters to enable the agency to meet immediate response needs before additional longer-term contracts are put into place. Pre-positioned contracts provide a variety of services and commodities, ranging from crisis counseling and housing inspection services to the delivery of critical commodities like generators, water, and meals. As of April 2019, FEMA has 87 pre-positioned contracts, 23 of which are to small businesses. Following a disaster, FEMA's goal is to contract with local companies within a declared disaster area for resource needs when practicable. Locally sourced contracts stimulate the local economy, create job opportunities, and support long-term recovery for affected communities. Since 2017, of the more than $6.9 billion obligated in support of disasters, locally sourced contracts made up more than $842 million, representing 12.2% of total disaster dollars obligated. Additionally, FEMA has an industry liaison program, which establishes strategic relationships with vendors and stakeholders, serves as an information provider for vendors seeking to do business with FEMA, and connects vendors with program offices in support of FEMA's mission. The program's goal is to support the availability of the right resources and services at the right time to local and state governments and disaster survivors. During the historic 2017 hurricane season, FEMA executed more than 3,500 disaster-related contract actions for a total obligation of $2.6 billion. In addition, the agency executed more than $1 billion in non-disaster contracts. This is more than a 100% increase in FEMA's annual expenditures and a 50% increase in the number of contracting actions from the prior year. Based on lessons learned from the 2017 hurricane season, as well as recommendations from the Government Accountability Office and the Department's Office of Inspector General, FEMA has made improvements in our contracting process. These include increasing the dollar ceiling on pre-positioned contracts, adjusting periods of performance on contracts so that none expire during hurricane season, awarding pre-positioned contracts to enhance transportation capabilities for island responses, and increasing the number of contracting personnel supporting disasters, specifically senior level and disaster acquisition staff. FEMA also introduced the Master Acquisition Planning System in 2016, a tool that results in acquisitions that are more cost-effective and best meet FEMA's needs through pre-planning of resources. As part of our ongoing outreach and education, FEMA's Procurement Disaster Assistance Team provides training to our partners to familiarize them with federal procurement standards applicable to FEMA's public assistance disaster grants. These teams deploy to disaster locations to provide our partners training where they need it, when they need it. FEMA is also in the process of developing a procurement toolkit that will help our partners develop their own pre-positioned contracts. I'm pleased to be here today to represent the dedicated FEMA staff and for the opportunity to discuss with you our important mission to help people before, during, and after disasters. I'm happy to take any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I now recognize Ms. Mack to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Payne and Chairwoman Torres Small, Ranking Members King and Crenshaw, and distinguished members of the subcommittees. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss federal contracting efforts in response to the 2017 hurricanes and wildfires. These efforts are critical, given that contracts play a key role in the immediate disaster response and longer-term community recovery. Also, effective planning and maximizing the use of contracts following a disaster can help FEMA to quickly and cost-effectively provide needed goods and services to survivors. Our most recent reports on advanced and post-disaster contracting indicate that FEMA continues to face several key challenges. The three areas that I would like to highlight today are contracting workforce issues, coordination, and transparency. First, in our reviews on disaster response, workforce has come up as a theme. Specific to contracting, FEMA leveraged contracting staff from its regions, headquarters, and its deployable contracting workforce to support disaster response. Yet we found that 8 out of FEMA's 10 regional offices have only one permanent full-time contracting official. Given that regional offices are responsible for managing most post-disaster contracts, as well as coordinating with states and localities on the use of these advanced contracts, not having enough contracting personnel becomes significant after a disaster hits. Recognizing this challenge, in the short term, FEMA plans to fill some of these gaps using contractor support and to hire some additional staff dedicated to disaster response. However, without assessing its current contracting workforce to determine what mission and skill gaps really exist, it will be difficult for FEMA to fill the contracting positions with the specific skills it needs to better respond to future disasters. Second, in our review of advanced contracts, those that are put in place prior to disasters so that it can be expedited in getting critical goods and services to the survivors, we found improvements could be made in federal coordination and information sharing with state and local governments. For example, we found inconsistencies with FEMA's efforts to perform regular outreach with states to help them in establishing their own advanced contracts, since they are really the first responders after a disaster hits. It is also important that states and localities, as well as FEMA's own workforce, are aware of what federal advanced contracts exist and how they can be leveraged. In this case, we found that FEMA's documentation listing advanced contracts did not consistently identify contracts for life-sustaining goods, such as generators, meals, manufactured housing units. As a result, FEMA contracting personnel and their state and local counterparts may not be well informed about the types of goods and services that are available. Recognizing these challenges, FEMA is developing a toolkit to share information on advanced contracts, but at the time of our review, it was still deciding what information to include. Finally, there's a lack of transparency regarding full extent of disaster contracting obligations. This is due to the criteria for closing a National Interest Action Code in the Federal Procurement Database System. It is the only public government-wide database that is used for tracking federal procurements. This code is what contracting personnel select when entering related contract information into the system. The closing of the codes for both Harvey and Irma, less than a year after the storms made landfall, make it significantly more difficult to determine the extent of federal contracting obligations. In contrast, codes for prior hurricanes were open for at least 5 years, with the Katrina code remaining open for 13 years. Without reevaluating the criteria to close these codes, the ability to identify and track federal contracting dollars for disasters is not comprehensive and provides limited visibility to all interested stakeholders, including Congress. Chairman Payne and Chairwoman Torres Small, Ranking Members King and Crenshaw, members of the subcommittees, this completes my statement. I would be prepared to respond to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Now I recognize Ms. Trimble to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Payne, Chairwoman Torres Small, Ranking Members King and Crenshaw, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss lessons learned from past disasters to improve FEMA contracting. My testimony today will focus on the Department of Homeland Security, Office of Inspector General's work to assess the efficiency and effectiveness of FEMA's contracting practices in support of disaster response and recovery efforts. As the OIG's body of work has shown, FEMA has long-standing challenges managing both its contracting process and ensuring locally awarded contracts meet federal requirements. First, let me provide some context. As you know, when disasters occur, state and local entities are the first to respond. But when the magnitude of a disaster exceeds the state, territorial, tribal, or local government's capabilities, FEMA may assist, including through awarding federal contracts. However, our recent work has demonstrated that FEMA contracting needs improvement. For example, in our recently issued report, we found FEMA did not follow all contracting laws, regulations, and procedures in awarding more than $30 million for 2 Bronze Star contracts for roof tarps and plastic sheeting. Although expediting the contract award process may be necessary following major disasters, FEMA's missteps could have caused a qualified bidder to be eliminated from further consideration, or, in the case of Bronze Star, an unqualified bidder receiving a federal contract. Failure of the Bronze Star contracts delayed FEMA's process for delivering crucial supplies to help Puerto Rican residents protect their homes after Hurricane Maria. FEMA did not concur with our recommendations, but told us that it is taking actions that we believe address the intent of our recommendations. In our March 2019 review of the Transitional Sheltering Assistance Program, we found FEMA released to its contractor the personally identifiable information of approximately 2.3 million disaster survivors of the 2017 hurricanes and wildfires. FEMA released survivors' financial account information, putting them at an increased risk of identity theft and fraud. This privacy incident occurred because FEMA lacked controls to ensure it shared only what the contractor needed to administer the TSA program. While we commend FEMA for already taking actions to address our recommendations, FEMA estimates it will not fully implement all recommendations until June of 2020, 1 year after the coming hurricane season. Now I will discuss contract-related challenges affecting local governments and impacting FEMA reimbursement. Following disasters, local communities contract for a range of goods and services. Yet our work has found FEMA faces significant challenges ensuring state and local governments understand and comply with federal requirements. From October 2014 through May 2019, we identified more than $363 million in contract costs ineligible for federal reimbursement because local entities did not follow federal contracting requirements. One common challenge with local contracts is monitoring debris removal. Debris removal costs are significant, averaging about 1/3 of total damage costs per recent hurricanes, or an estimated $1.5 billion in Florida and Georgia following Hurricane Irma. Our September 2018 management alert highlights the financial risks involved when contractors are not properly monitored. FEMA's guidance places the responsibility for monitoring debris removal operations on local governments. We generally found that local governments hired contractors, debris monitoring companies, to oversee other contractors, debris haulers. We also found that FEMA and the state did not perform direct monitoring to ensure local governments fulfilled their responsibilities. Debris monitoring companies are responsible for estimating debris loads. If monitors overestimate the amount of debris collected, local governments will pay more than they should and then request federal reimbursement at an inflated cost to taxpayers. Our team traveled to Florida and Georgia and observed debris removal operations firsthand. These pictures from our fieldwork depict truckloads that the monitor overestimated as 50 to 90% full, when in reality, the trucks were only 25 to 50% full. Our review found that when FEMA provided even limited oversight, such as it did in Georgia, it identified almost $500,000 in ineligible debris costs for one county in just 1 week. In closing, the massive scale of damage caused by seemingly more frequent disasters and the large number of high dollar value contracts that FEMA and local communities will continue to award pose grave concern. For these reasons, we continue to review these areas, aiming to emphasize the need for positive change. We will advise you of the results of our ongoing work once it is completed. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairwoman, this concludes my testimony. I'm happy to answer any questions you or the other members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I'll remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize myself for questions. Let's see. I'd really like to start with the Bronze Star issue. My understanding is that the company was formed a month before Hurricane Maria hit, had only 2 employees, and had never held a government contract. And yet FEMA awarded the company 2 contracts worth more than $30 million with the expectation that it would deliver 475,000 emergency tarps and 60,000 units of plastic sheathing for temporary roof repairs. For perspective, I have a visual on the monitors of the emergency tarps that were used on homes and buildings after Hurricane Maria. As you can see, there are a lot of structures with substantial roof damage. Disaster survivors needed these tarps. Ms. Trimble, can you tell the subcommittee what happened to the 2 contracts given to Bronze Star?
So shortly after the contracts were awarded to Bronze Star, FEMA learned that Bronze Star would not be able to deliver the tarps in the time frame specified. That's the bottom line. I can go into a little bit, if you like, as to the problems we uncovered during the solicitation and award process that led to that outcome.
Okay. Mr. Kamoy, was FEMA aware that Bronze Star, a 2-person company, formed more than 1 month before Hurricane Maria hit landfall, didn't have any prior experience before awarding its contracts for emergency tarps and plastic sheathing? And if so, did this raise any red flags for you?
Thank you, Chairman Payne. Bronze Star was awarded those contracts after full and open competition. Lack of prior experience is not a reason to preclude a vendor from competing. They were determined to be technically acceptable and financially responsible and otherwise eligible. Those contracts ended up being that the TARP contract, one of 6 contracts, so we had redundant capability. And as soon as it became clear to us that they were unable to perform, we terminated the contracts, and Bronze Star was not paid under those contracts at all.
Can the OIG respond to that, please?
So in our review of the 2 Bronze Star contracts, we did find some missteps that FEMA took that we believe could have led to different outcomes. First of all, contracting staff did not use the disaster response registry, which is required by the FAR, to look at potential vendors for the types of supplies and services they needed, including plastic sheeting and blue tarps. Second, the solicitations that FEMA posted included inappropriate or incorrect clauses as to what the source of the materials should be. What FEMA posted was that all materials had to be from the U.S., when in fact they meant to post a clause that would have permitted a little more flexibility and allowed for some materials to come from outside of the U.S. That led to the third problem, that when FEMA personnel reviewed the solicitations it received, the offers it received, rather than holding the bidders to the Buy America, the America only standard, it actually did review the offers based on the broader allowing of materials from outside of the U.S. The problem with that is that by posting a solicitation that required Buy America only U.S. sourced products, I think FEMA missed out on the chance for other companies to bid, and then it was not an appropriate technical evaluation to say that Bronze Star and the other bidder met the terms of the contract, because they didn't, because Bronze Star said that it would be sourcing materials from both the U.S. and outside of the U.S. And then finally, our fourth observation was that we felt FEMA could have done more to confirm that Bronze Star would ultimately be able to meet the terms of the contract. For example, in the follow-on solicitation after Bronze Star failed, FEMA did ask the next contractors to provide more information verifying that they would in fact be able to meet the terms of the contract.
Okay. Well, I'm going to try to stick within the parameters, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to, we obviously see how big a problem this one company was. And I will recognize the ranking member, Mr. King.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, thank all the witnesses for your testimony. Mr. Kamoy, national interest action codes are used to track contract actions across the federal government as they relate to a particular disaster. And these codes, though, can have arbitrary closing dates. For instance, the NAA code for Katrina lasted for 13 years. The NAA code for Hurricane Sandy remained open for over 5 years. But after only 9.5 months, the NAA codes for Harvey and Irma were closed. Can you tell me what the criteria is for deciding when to keep them open and when to close them?
Sure. The national interest action codes are governed by an agreement, a memorandum of agreement between the General Services Administration, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense. And based on the GAO's recommendation, and I believe I saw in the General Services Administration response, we'll revisit those timelines with GSA and DOD.
Mr. Trimble, could you comment on that, as the disparity between 13 years and 9.5 months? I'm not suggesting anything's wrong. I'm just wondering why there's such a disparity.
So that was work that Ms. Max spoke to, if you would like to ask her the question.
When we asked Department of Homeland Security why they closed these National Interest Action Codes, or NIA codes, their rationale was very inconsistent with the criteria that they have in this memorandum of agreement between these three departments. One of them, they said, was the purpose of these NIA codes is to track federal procurement related to response and not recovery. But their own agreement says it covers response and recovery. Another reason they gave us was that the number of contract actions that FEMA was making had decreased. Our concern there was that there were other components still within DHS as well as DOD that continue to execute contracts related to both Harvey and Irma. And then DHS also pointed to FEMA's own internal tracking system that has the ability to track contracts by disaster and budget line. But not all other agencies that respond to that way have these internal systems. And then remember, internal agency systems are not available to the public, and there is no one-stop shopping for a government-wide database other than this federal procurement database system.
Okay. Thank you. Trying to get some good news out of bad news. Obviously, we hear, critiques at these type hearings, and I understand that, but how effective do you think FEMA is at lessons learned? For instance, having lived through Sandy and saw the devastation there, what lessons were learned from that were successfully applied to subsequent hurricanes? In other words, can you show the actually positive action that resulted from Sandy? And I guess I asked, we'll start with the IG.
Sure, thank you. So I think we've seen some mixed results in how FEMA's responded to the recommendations related to our body of work. We have years worth of work looking at FEMA's relationship with state and local governments as they carry out work for disaster response and recovery, which is not, done through direct FEMA contracts, but the state and local governments, they issue their own contracts that are then eligible for federal reimbursement. So we, for years, have been recommending to FEMA, well, first of all, we've been finding for years that local governments aren't doing a very good job at following federal contracting requirements, such as full and open competition or providing opportunities for local, small, and disadvantaged businesses. We also, through the years, have made a number of observations and often recommend that money that the local governments are requesting to be reimbursed is not, in fact, eligible because they haven't followed federal procurement contracting rules. FEMA has kind of a mixed bag in responding to our recommendations. They often don't take back money from local governments, which can be understandable, but what we're looking for is for FEMA to provide more specific information to state and local governments to make sure this problem doesn't happen in the first place, to make sure that local governments fully understand the requirements they're expected to adhere to if they're going to request to be reimbursed with federal funds.
Time is just about up. Ms. Mack, do you have any further comments on that, or Mr. Kamoy?
From a GAO perspective, our biggest concerns with FEMA in terms of being able to addressing these contracts are a lack of strategy and then guidance to do a lot of these things, and then the systemic issue of acquisition planning. Given that workforce is such a challenge as well, guidance is extremely important to have that in place so people can at least know where to go, what to see. And the same thing applies for advanced contracts, being able to have some guidance in place, and then the strategy of how we do it, the long-term, broader look of how we do it, and how we can be better prepared.
Mr. Kamoy?
Thank you, Ranking Member King. Since you mentioned Sandy, I'll just cite a few things that have happened since Sandy, which we believe are improving.
Quickly.
Since Hurricane Sandy, we have tripled our number of contracting officers from 45 to 163. In our Office of the Chief Procurement Officer, we established expeditionary and incident support branches. Our competition rate for contracts in FY17, 85% of our contracts were competitive. In 18, it was 77%. And even GAO noted we have been responsive in training our contracting officers on defining the local area, for example. For
Chairman, sort of give me a look here, so you're going over the time. But anyway, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, sir. Next, we'll hear from the gentlelady from New Mexico, Chairwoman Torres Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kamoy, I really appreciate you noting FEMA's role both before, during, and after disaster. And I want to touch on FEMA's communication and coordination challenges with state and local governments, something that all of you have touched on during your testimony. A community I serve, the village of Ruidoso, New Mexico, has been struggling for more than 10 years to negotiate federal assistance for extensive flooding that occurred back in 2008. Based on guidance from FEMA, the village awarded contracts for bridge replacements and is in the process of awarding contracts for extensive sewer repairs. As I understand it now, after a significant portion of the work is complete, FEMA has decided that some of the projects are no longer eligible for federal assistance. And after 10 years of slow correspondence, challenging regulations, and employee turnover, we're seeing local officials that have been given a June 2020 deadline to complete all remaining construction. Mr. Kamoy, I don't expect you to have the details on this particular situation, but can I have your commitment today that someone at FEMA will look further into this issue and communicate its findings with my office and the village of Ruidoso? Absolutely, Chairwoman Torres Small. Thank you. One word on our assistance or our coordination with state and local government. And a development, I believe, certainly since Katrina, is our procurement disaster assistance team. This is a team of highly trained attorneys and contract specialists that we deploy to disasters to provide guidance to our state and local partners on federal procurement requirements and the requirements of our public assistance grant program. And in FY19 thus far, they have been deployed to 80% of declared disasters. So we recognize the importance of providing good guidance. Thank you. And I'm glad to see that improvement made. The challenge is rehashing kind of what happened in 2008 before a lot of these improvements were made. You have my commitment. We'll follow up. Thank you. Now I'm shifting a bit. FEMA's 2017 After Action report found that the agency's advanced contracts were exhausted after the hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And so FEMA committed to awarding new contracts for future storms. I noted that you recognize there are 87 current contracts. What is FEMA's process for determining that number, and what types of contracts that are issued for advanced contracts? That's a great question, Chairwoman Torres Small. We work with our program offices, the Office of Response and Recovery. We look at the needs of, essentially the last several disaster seasons to understand where, had we had advanced contracts in place, we might have delivered, more quickly or more comprehensively.
So it's a lessons learned process and working with our field offices in our regions to understand what it is we would need in place to put the right agreements in place.
Are you confident you have all of the advanced contracts you need for the 2019 hurricane season?
Yes.
In December 2018, a GAO report found that FEMA did not have an up-to-date strategy and clear guidance for its own contracting staff on the use of advanced contracts. And Ms. Trimble noted how such guidance could have helped in avoiding the contracting mistakes with Bronze Star. Mr. Kamoy, what steps is FEMA taking to address GAO's finding?
I appreciate the question, Chairwoman Torres-Small. We do hold training, regular training with our disaster procurement staff, and in fact, from April 29th to May 3rd, we had over 100 of our staff, including a disaster acquisition response team in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I've looked at the agenda of that multiple day training, and it includes everything from advanced contracting to local set-asides to documentation required when we deviate from local set-asides. So we continually provide training and guidance to our staff.
Thank you. And Ms. Mack, how would you assess that response so far?
Our concern with the training is that when they provide the training, they have an advanced contract list that is different than what FEMA headquarters has as their consolidated advanced contract list. When there's two resources being used as advanced contract lists and they differ, it causes differences of what the states and localities know, and within FEMA, they don't know what advanced contract lists are, what they're using. And both of those, we talk to officials, they're using both of those as resources. That inconsistency creates confusion. It creates, okay, what can I use? What's really available within FEMA? And then externally to the states and localities. It, again, creates confusion, so the states and localities don't really know what's available from the federal government.
Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Crenshaw, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I want to start with where I left off on my opening statement about the report from the General Land Office from Texas. And I would again recommend everyone take a look at that. Some of the best ideas will come from local levels. And some of the issues they saw there were attempts to, I think, devolve some of the responsibilities down to the state level, where they understand their population better, they understand what needs to be done, and can remove certain issues such as overlap, lack of coordination, and just more generally keeping the government solutions to the lowest possible level. Are you aware of any other states, or is this conversation come up before, where states are asking to take on some of the roles traditionally done by FEMA with simply overarching support by FEMA?
Thank you, Ranking Member Crenshaw. I mean, our philosophy in disaster response is that disasters should be federally supported, state managed, and locally executed. So I think it's a continual conversation about the relative roles and responsibilities and who can serve the population best. I'm not familiar with that particular Texas Land Office report, but I look forward to reading it.
Okay. What kind of progress has there been made in what has been brought up before with this better communications with states on what exactly FEMA is going to do and what exactly the state is going to do? Has there been any progress in that direction? As it relates to contracts specifically, too.
I think the procurement disaster assistance team has made great strides in clarifying that, and that they've been to 80% of the declared disasters this year. And I believe last year they got to 70%. We continue to clarify and provide guidance. And even on debris monitoring, we're looking at how to update our debris monitoring guidance. We've made our partners aware that debris monitors are a reimbursable expense under the public assistance program. We're looking at developing uniform guidance on non-compliance, so what our state and local partners can do about contractors who do not perform. Can we communicate better? I would submit to you, sir, we can always communicate better and always clarify. I do believe we've made progress.
I appreciate that. I'm also especially concerned about the record keeping issue. It's really hard to figure out what to do better if we don't if we don't keep good records, and this came up with the NIA issue as well. What is being done to fix that?
So in accordance with the GAO's recommendation, my understanding is that the 3 departments who are the parties to that memorandum of agreement about the timeline and the criteria for the closure of the National Incident Action Codes will revisit that agreement and make sure that we're providing the transparency we need.
Okay. On the related to workforce issues, it's one of the most important things that ensures success. And you mentioned before that you've increased pretty markedly the number of contractors working. That's good news. How are they incentivized, though, to make the most efficient and effective decisions? So we're hearing a lot about the Bronze Star issue. Are there consequences when someone blatantly makes a mistake like this? How does that work?
So on the workforce issue, because I've not actually talked about it in any depth, I mean, in addition to contractual support, we put an acquisition support contract in place with 21 staff. We are seeking to fill an additional 51 of cadre of on-call response and recovery staff, but we've also made available no additional staff members of our existing procurement office in terms of their number, but we've cross-trained them to all in our operations branch support the National Response Coordination Center. There's 69 available. As to your question as to accountability, the Bronze Star contract was a full and open competition and found technically acceptable. We continue to provide guidance. We use that as a lesson learned. And so we continue to work with our workforce to make sure they're making the most effective, efficient decisions they can.
Okay, I want to end with a question about the MAPS system. This is a recent system that got put in place to improve how workers can use the contracting system. But it was also reported that many in the program office are unfamiliar with the system. And so my question is, are there any problems with the system that you would like to share with this committee? And are there any problems with getting everyone trained up on it?
So it is a system that allows us to tell our program offices, for example, 18 months in advance of an expiration of a contract in place so that we can work with them to plan for that acquisition. So it will take continual reinforcement, training, and guidance to get everybody to take maximum advantage of it. I don't think that's a problem of the system so far as change management and making sure everybody knows of the resource that's available.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Next, we will have the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kamoy, I appreciate that some of these things we've talked about happened before you got there, but I think we need to hear what steps FEMA's taken so that we can avoid another tribute contracting problem or a whitefish energy problem or a situation where one very generous chef in a paella pan can feed more people than FEMA can. But what I hear from you is just kind of piecemeal responses as opposed to any overall strategy. You continue to defend the contract with Bronze Star, and we've heard, well, they've done a little, they're looking at it, but you know, here's the title of the report. FEMA should not have awarded 2 contracts to Bronze Star LLC. That's about as plain as you can get. I mean, it doesn't say maybe they did and it was legal and they looked at everything. It says they should not have awarded it. That doesn't leave much question for doubt. So I think what we need from you is a strategy where you are looking at systemic changes, not just responding to individual disasters or contracts. But having said that, I want to ask you some more about the workforce issue. I chair the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management. We have jurisdiction over the Stafford Act, so we're going to have some hearings in the coming weeks with the Deputy Administrator, and we won't talk about the shortfalls. You mentioned a few figures just there, but I have some basic questions. Have you looked at whether you think it would be better to have government employees or long-term contracts to fill these workforce needs? And do you have a strategy of that? Do you have a list of the contracts that you have in place to kind of get ahead of the game as opposed to responding to incidents? Can you address those issues?
Absolutely, Congresswoman Titus. Thank you for the questions. We are in the final stages, and I'm sure Deputy or Acting Administrator Gaynor will speak to this when he visits with you, of a coordinated workforce review where we have looked at our incident management workforce in an attempt strategically to right-size it and look at what kinds of personnel would best fit those needs. We do have contractors in that workforce in our public assistance and individual assistance, technical assistance positions, for example, and then we have other types of positions for others. So once that coordinated workforce review is completed, we'd be glad to provide it to you and the committee, but we are taking a close look at that. In terms of, I just want to say, in terms of systemically looking at contracts, we do an after action and look systemically across all of our contracts. I would submit to you, we never like to see a contractor not perform. We don't want to terminate for non-performance. In the 2017 hurricane season, between 59 advanced contracts and 1,973 post-disaster contracts, out of 2,032 contracts, we terminated 4 for non-performance. Do we like to see that? Of course not. Is that evidence of a systemic problem that we need to address? It's an awful small percentage of the overall contracts. But we've taken the recommendations seriously. We have taken steps to require more information from potential vendors so that we can make responsibility determinations. And we take our stewardship of taxpayer dollars very seriously. We do look systemically at our contracting.
I believe it was mentioned earlier that one of the contracts you gave was to companies that had been kind of blacklisted or not used by other agencies. When you're choosing the contracts, do you look at that information to see if they have a record with other government agencies that might not have been successful?
We do, Congresswoman. I believe you're referring to Tribute, and there was what I would consider to be derogatory information, but unfortunately the system of record that kept that information kept it for 3 years. And it turns out, upon further review, the derogatory information about non-performance was over 3 years old. In fact, it was 5 years old. We paid Tribute only for what it delivered, the meals that it delivered, and that was one of 8 feeding contracts. And so we had redundant capability to provide what disaster survivors needed.
Is there anything legislative that you need to allow you to do this better?
Ma'am, I can't think of another authority. If we do, we'll certainly let you know. I believe we have the authorities we need. It relies on us continuing to train our contracting professionals who are very much on the lookout to make sure we're being responsible stewards of the taxpayer dollars.
Did GAO agree with this assessment?
Our biggest concern when it comes to managing these contracts, like you indicated, is workforce. Until they really do even as I mentioned earlier, hiring contractor support and term-limited staff, dedicated disaster response, that's like a Band-Aid. That's a short-term solution. They have to have a long-term strategic plan. And the assessment that they gave us for 2018 to us was not really an assessment. It just included numbers of people, of contracting officials. It didn't identify what kind of contracting officials you need. There are differences in contracting officials. And then where do you want them? In the regions, like I mentioned, if you only have one full-time contracting official in each one of the 8 of the regions, that's a problem. So we need them to identify where and what, long-term, have a strategy and put in place, and when is that going to happen? So we've asked for a timeline and a plan.
We'd like to see that if you get that.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, we'll have the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank the witnesses today speaking to us in this important hearing. Regarding advanced contracts, I have several questions. In the continental United States, responding to a disaster, when FEMA responds to a disaster, access to the affected and impacted communities and populations, we find a way to get there regardless of road damage and bridges. Again, you're dealing with the continental United States, but when dealing with an island like Puerto Rico, One of the things that I encountered, was quite frustrating in the effort to respond. I represent South Louisiana. We have major ports and a tremendous skill set there, very compassionate people. We're certainly accustomed to dealing with natural disasters and hurricanes, and have a density of population of men and women that generationally know how to respond and wanted to go help in Puerto Rico. One of those assets, shall we say, in South Louisiana, included barges that could quickly establish beach landing and access roads to the major roads and arteries to distribute FEMA's pre-positioned, pre-contracted services to the impacted areas and populations of Puerto Rico. Because the traditional access through the established ports and through the roads and bridges, you couldn't get anything anywhere. So in the common sense planning for advanced contracts, when we're dealing with islands, populations, does FEMA now have a plan to have advanced contracts for barge access, for beach landings? These guys can quickly establish access roads to distribute materials that ended up sitting in the ports and on the docks in Puerto Rico for a long time. It was quite challenging to get that relief material and services, supplies, et cetera, to the impacted populations. What has FEMA done since then regarding beach access via barge?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Higgins. We have enhanced our transportation contracts, shipping and air for both the islands and Alaska. I'll need to follow up with you on the details because I think you're mentioning some specific modes of transport, and I don't want to misspeak, but we have addressed with advanced contracts.
Can my office reach out to your office and share some data with you regarding that?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'd like to move on. Building code enforcement in Puerto Rico is a concern that all of us should have. As American treasures harvested from the paychecks of working Americans and distributed quite compassionately in large amounts. And in America, we have an expectation that you mentioned the stewardship of these funds. And so building code enforcement, generally speaking, what's your observation on that? How strong? They've adopted new codes, which is encouraging. But how do you see the enforcement of building codes now that we're a year into this thing?
Mr. Higgins, enforcement of building codes is outside both my expertise and area of responsibility. So I'm going to take
within your parameter of opinion, though.
I'm going to take the question back, and we'll follow up with you on the agency's view.
Safe answer from a witness. One final question. What policies are in place to encourage contractors that have contracted with FEMA to avoid participating in fraud or accusations of fraud with subcontractors? I've had conversations with subcontractors that were encouraged to do work and then never paid by folks that had contracts with FEMA, and they had no recourse through the government because their contract wasn't with the government. What investigative authority do you have? What recourse do these subcontractors have? What policies do you have in place to protect against fraud? And with my remaining time, please answer that, sir.
Certainly, we do take the stewardship seriously. We do provide oversight. I don't know the answer on what recourse or what remedies subcontractors have, but of course we have our Office of Inspector General within my division of FEMA, the Office of the Chief Security Officer. We have a fraud investigations unit.
Can you get the committee back a more specific answer on that? And my time has expired, but we would appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, sir. Next, we'll have the gentleman from New York, Mr. Rose.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm always slightly interested in yielding all my time to Mr. Higgins because I always do enjoy your questions, sir. So, but I'll resist. I'll resist. You know, my district was one of the hardest hit by Hurricane Sandy. We experienced firsthand how many bad contractors were really hired and how they just totally failed the great people of Staten Island and South Brooklyn and New York City. Misinformation led to just absolute chaos in the days after the storm. Contractors on the ground, they kept changing the rules on victims while losing their paperwork over and over and over again. They were overpaid. People got rich. And believe it or not, my district office still has active cases dealing with this recovery. So, you know, you all, I don't want to be redundant because we're all here with the shared interest of trying to fix something. So, sir, Kamoy, right? Kamoy.
Yes, Kamoy.
You said something that intrigued me just now. You said basically Congress can't give you any additional authority. You're good to go. And my question is very simple. Are we? You know, in the event the next superstorm is coming, the next hurricane is coming, you've said you've learned lessons from the past. When another natural disaster hits my community or any of ours, is FEMA going to be there to get the job done? And what else can we do to ensure that that's the case?
Congressman Rose, I appreciate the question. So my response on do we need additional authorities was related to looking systemically at our contracting practices. And when Ms. Titus, Congresswoman Titus asked me that question, I can't think of any additional authority we need to look at our contracting. Congress did provide us on the response and recovery side. Now I'm going well beyond contracting and just the agency's overall response and recovery. Congress gave us, and we very much appreciate the authorities you provided us in the Disaster Recovery Reform Act that we are very actively implementing. Everything from our ability to increase administrative cost reimbursement to our state partners, to authorities with our workforce. So we asked you, and you provided a great deal of authority in that legislation.
And that authority basically authorizes you to prepare for something, pre-advanced contracting, so on and so forth. Is there any mechanism in place, and this is for all of you, for us to ensure district by district that you've done that? So if I could have a superstorm hit next week, is there any database that I can look and say, all right, man, FEMA's good to go. We got our X, Y, Z contractors already in place. Do we have any system in place where I can ensure that you have done your job?
So what we have is our national preparedness report, and we work with our state and local partners where they report to us their capability gaps. We invest in non-disaster and preparedness grant funding. So we do report against kind of core capabilities that do give us a general sense of our preparedness. I'll have to go back and talk with my colleagues about whether that's county by county.
Yeah, that would be, or congressional district by congressional district, however you want to organize, it would be wonderful. And I do want to make a formal request that you get back to us on that you've just said when it comes to contracting, given us the authority you need, now we want to be able to check that you've exercised that authority. Yes, ma'am.
What we found was that there's inconsistent coordination within the regions. Different regions, some coordinated a little more regularly and some did not. So therefore, we did make a recommendation to have more regular coordination to achieve those benefits that you're talking about, because the positive relationships can help in terms of the FEMA and the state emergency management personnel, providing opportunities for both FEMA and the states and localities to establish their contracts, the advanced contracts that they need, and knowing which contracts are available, and then as well as FEMA knowing what the state can do to respond initially before the federal government.
Absolutely. Look, we'll help you find the plumbers and the roofers.
We definitely found inconsistencies.
We all have those folks in need of work, but no one wants to be caught flat-footed again. Thank you. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, sir. We will now hear from the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this hearing. Certainly, the last year that I was in the Texas Senate last year, we had a lot of Harvey hearings. and became very familiar. There was a lot of hand-wringing. Obviously, it's tremendously complicated to recover from a disaster. And I would commend Commissioner Bush's report from the GAO in Texas, which was the point for Harvey recovery in Texas that Ranking Member Crenshaw put into the record. I think that is a very good lessons learned that Texas had in their experience interacting with FEMA. And clearly that was a very important experience for my state. Just specifically, and I wanted to just, Mr. Camoni, just wanted to go to your testimony, your written testimony. You outline a series of changes or improvements, and I'll just quickly read the headlines here. Increasing the dollar ceiling, adjusting periods of performance, enhancing the transportation capabilities for island responses, increasing the number of contracting personnel to support disasters, increasing the number of disaster acquisition response team staff, increasing the number of senior level acquisition personnel, and filling critical vacancies. And so my question to you is, it sounds like these improvements are underway, but are there pieces of these improvements that you need statutory assistance? In other words, is there legislation that's required from the United States Congress to assist FEMA to implement these changes? These seems like good changes. I think they're well thought through. I know you're implementing them, but what can we do? What is our role?
Thank you, Congressman Taylor. In a number of cases that you've cited, they're completed. Are increasing the dollar ceiling, adjusting periods of performance, enhancing transportation capabilities. We'll need to think about whether any statutory changes are required to implement the others. At this point, I cannot think of any, but if we do, we'll follow up with you.
Okay, and I mean, it's, obviously, our job is to legislate and your job is to act. So, if there's statutory assistance that you need, I would, let us know. I mean, we obviously are all here for the same thing, to have a great disaster response recovery effort, and that is a collective effort, and certainly Congress is part of that. If you don't have the statutory authority that you need, I think just building on what Congressman Rose mentioned, shifting over to Texas specifically, something that I heard over and over again last year from local governments was the inability to understand from FEMA whether or not a contract had been awarded, what the extent was, the services that would be provided. And they were generally frustrated that they just couldn't seem to quite get straight answers. And I just wanted to kind of hear what your thoughts were about how we can get more certainty for a subdivision to know, hey, this is taken care of. This tarp thing is taken care of. This water thing is taken care of. These meals are taken care of. This debris removal has been taken care of. Because clearly certainty is important for people to operate. Because if they know you don't have it, well, then they can go work on it themselves. But if they're unclear, if they call and say, well, I don't know, we can't help you, that's very frustrating for that mayor, for the head of that particular mud district, whatever that subdivision in Texas may be.
So I appreciate that, Congressman Taylor. I think it is going to require more communication and coordination with our state and local partners, our procurement disaster assistance team, these folks we deploy. We will continue to provide guidance and help our partners in navigating not just the regulatory requirements, but the clarity you're asking for in terms of spelling out kind of what's in and what's out. And then the last thing I'll say on the legislative offer, again, I appreciate it. And I'll just say again, we appreciate very much the Disaster Recovery Reform Act that Congress passed, gave us a lot of authorities that we needed. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm sort of reattacking this, but what are you going to do so the next disaster, a mayor knows when he calls, he gets a definitive answer that, yeah, it has been approved, no, it hasn't?
We'll continue to reach out through our regional offices, through our joint field offices who are on the ground in the local community to make sure that we're providing the accurate information and answering the questions. And so, what we can do is ensure that our personnel are trained and have built relationships with those local officials so that they can get their questions answered in both a timely and accurate way. So I will be sure that we will take back and work with our regional colleagues and our procurement disaster assistance team to make sure we're providing that guidance.
I have to say I'm not totally satisfied with your answer, but I appreciate your effort to respond to it. You're welcome to come back to my office and respond in writing, but I really want to, this is important. Subdivisions deserve to know certainty, and saying we're going to train well and work harder, that doesn't, I'm sorry, I'm out of time, but we can discuss this offline. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Next, we'll have the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member and our alternative chair or additional chair, Ms. Torres, and I thank our expert witness for appearing before us today. I just want to say at the outset that I want to join in Congressman Rose's request for a district-by-district contracting assessment and plan. I think that will be very important because we're talking about natural disasters, and we're talking about them as if they are in the past, when just last week we had a suite of tornadoes rip through the southern part of our nation. So I believe, quite frankly, that we need to be forward-leaning with respect to this, and it's really critical that FEMA get its footing so that, again, we're able to move forward with the forecast of a lot of these naturally occurring types of events, so that we're not, in retrospect, or we're not flat-footed dealing with these issues. And that's why I think this national interest action system is so very important, because when you don't have a consistent basis for analysis, 10 years here, 5 years there, 6 months there, it doesn't give you the real view to how we can improve and what our improvement has been. You may be able to sit here and say, I see improvement. For the rest of us, we're saying, well, I was hit by Superstorm Sandy and people in my district are still recovering, right? So I want to drill down a little bit more about the NEA code. Ms. Mack, in a sentence or two, can you please describe what the National Interest Action Code is?
Sure, thank you for the question. Basically, when any contract is being put in place, contracting officials have to put that information into this system, this federal database system. And when you track it, when we do our analysis, we go pull it from that NEA code. Now, when the NEA code's closed, to be able to track that information, we actually did some data analysis after the NEA codes were closed to just see what kind of information we could get. We used the description field.
So essentially, these codes allow you and the public to track contracting activity for specific disasters.
Absolutely, you're correct.
From GAO's perspective, how long should a NEA code remain open after a disaster to accurately track contract obligations?
I think it differs from disaster to disaster, depending on how large the impact, how far it is, and those kind of things. So we don't really say what time frame, but we have noticed that in the past, they're open anywhere from 2 to 4 years, at least better than 1 year or less than a year.
Right, and then so the question becomes, should we be categorizing? For instance, a rural community gets hit by a tornado. You're dealing with a less densely populated area than perhaps an urban area or even a suburban area. Or maybe even looking at the regions, what the density, population density, and the assets in a particular area would be. Do you think that sort of categorizing would then enable us to look at what time frames should be applicable, or?
That's possible if they if the data is historically collected and that analysis is done. As far as we're aware of, it's not.
Very well. I want to shift gears very quickly to the question of these debris removal contracts. There's going to be a lot of debris removal when you see these types of events occurring on a almost monthly basis. And so I want to ask Ms. Trimble, regarding policy changes FEMA made for overseeing debris removal operations, the new policy eliminated federal and state oversight of debris removal activities. Because of the policy changes, local contractors in Florida and Georgia, for instance, were able to overstate debris loads and overcharge the federal government, and this put more than $1.5 billion of taxpayer dollars at risk. Can you explain this issue a bit more?
FEMA consolidated all its different pieces of guidance related to public assistance. So that's the grant program through which local communities get reimbursed for their disaster response. Oh, I'm sorry. So two points to make here, that in 2016, FEMA consolidated all its different pieces of public assistance grant program guidance into one consolidated guide. However, when it did that, and for example, in the case of debris removal, about 100 pages worth of very specific debris removal and monitoring guidance that was available to local communities was cut out of, that ultimate guide that was published in 2016. And so you have two problems. And then, as you said, at the same time, the responsibilities for FEMA and the states to oversee local debris removal and monitoring activities went away. So you had two things happen at the same time that I think led to the problems that we saw when our teams were out in Florida and Georgia doing their work. So as I alluded to earlier, there really is a need for FEMA to provide that more detailed information again. It actually still is out there, and some local communities know where to find it because they've used it before. But the concern is that new communities, or new officials, in communities who haven't worked with it before might not find it as readily. And furthermore, just the way the new public assistance guidance has been consolidated, it's not necessarily clear what certain roles and responsibilities might be.
Very well. I thank you, Mr. Kamoy. I'm sorry my time has run out, but I'd like to ask that if you can go back and develop clear rules and guidance for monitoring debris removal operations, what would be done to comply with those recommendations? If you provide that to our chairman, that'd be very helpful. Mr. Chairman, yes, Madam Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we'll have the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank all others that I should thank as well. Please allow me to thank all of you for what you do. I understand that it's very difficult. I have a number of questions. The first has to do with CDBG-DR. Are there any recommendations that you have that would assist you for us to help you and assist you in the use of these CDBG-DR funds, Community Development Disaster Relief Funds? Any recommendations?
Congressman Green, that's outside my area of responsibility and expertise, but I'll take that back to the agency for my colleagues who would be most familiar with those grant programs.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate it. As you know, we're still waiting in Texas for some of that funding to arrive. So I thought I'd just take a shot, see if there was some possibility that you might be able to give some assistance. Here's another one. In my city, we hear the words shelter in place. And there are many persons who have no shelter to shelter in place. Churches will open their doors, and they will sometimes have some minor damages. They provide food, blankets. How does FEMA interact with the churches? How do we get that done so that they can be properly compensated?
So we do have an Office of Faith-Based Organizations, and its director, Kevin Smith. I'll be glad to talk with him, and perhaps he might be able to follow up with you and provide you information on how we interact with faith-based organizations.
Do you contract with any of the churches for shelter? I know that the municipalities will usually provide some places for shelter. In Houston, we have the Astrodome, and we have other facilities, but do you?
I'm sorry, Congressman, that's just outside my area of knowledge, so we'll be sure to follow up in writing with information about that.
Well, let me just continue outside your area for a few more. Let's talk for just a moment about the 20,000 pallets of water in Puerto Rico. I went down there, 20,000 pallets of bottled water that did not go used timely. Can you tell me anything about that?
So my understanding is that the contractor distributed water when they were supposed to dispose of it. Some of it was past its expiration date, and I believe we terminated and wrote to them regarding their non-compliance with the contract that we let for disposal of water bottles, plastic caps, and pallets.
Ms. Mack, do you have anything that you would add?
This issue really comes down to understanding what the requirements are, and that's a challenge that we also found that FEMA has faced in its acquisition planning process. If you can't define what you really need, how much you need, and those kind of things, that's a problem because it requires more time for contracting officials. They might award initial contract, and then they might have to follow up with several other contracts. So we have also asked that they really look at the acquisition planning process in terms of defining requirements.
Quickly, probably outside your area of expertise, but what percentage of your contracts are awarded to minorities and women?
That is in my area of expertise. I don't know the number, but we'll follow up in writing with that.
Mm-hmm. That's a very important thing for you to do. And if you would, I'd like to also get some sense of the number of persons that are from the impacted area. As you know, in Puerto Rico, there was a big complaint, significant complaint that people from the area were not being utilized. People were coming in from the mainland to service people on the island. So it would be of great benefit to know these things. Now, how am I assured that I'll hear from you? Who will be contacting me?
Our Legislative Affairs Division will follow up with this information.
Okay, and if they do not, am I at liberty to call you?
Yes.
Okay. Final question, Mr. Chairman, if I may, just want to ask one more. Timely payment of contractors, small contractors. I get complaints from contractors who are telling me that they are not being paid timely, and I understand that you no longer handle debris. You stop contracting that out. The municipalities do it. But can you provide any degree of oversight? And maybe I should have Ms. Mack respond, but such that these small contractors will be paid timely.
Quickly.
So we certainly can provide guidance to our state and local partners about timely payment and our expectations regarding how they exercise their responsibility under the grant programs. So our procurement disaster assistance team can reinforce that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let's see, we'll quickly try to go through maybe one or two questions. I just had a very important question that has been concerning me since I was brought to my attention. DHS OIG issued a report, OIG 19-32, in March of 2019, indicating that FEMA unnecessarily shared the personally identifiable information and sensitive personally identifiable information of 2.3 million of disaster survivors with a contractor. Shared their personal information with this contractor. What safeguards have you put in place to ensure that an incident like this does not happen again? I mean, this is bank records, social security numbers. I mean, you know, the most personal information that we hold sacred that is, you know, has been exposed. I mean, over 2 million people. How does something like that happen?
Thank you, Chairman Payne. So the contractor at issue administered the Transitional Sheltering Assistance Program for us, and we changed the business model. It used to be that survivors would check into transitional housing, a hotel, provide their credit card, and we would reimburse the survivor for those expenses. We changed the business model such that we now have the contractor pay hotels directly, but we didn't turn off the sharing of the information. So upon learning that that data was still being transmitted to the contractor, who before the business model changed, fully authorized to receive that information in administration of the program. We stopped sharing the data. We purged it from their systems. We have no evidence that that data in their systems was at any time breached. We have no evidence that any survivor has suffered identity theft or loss because of that sharing. Did you let them know this has happened? We are working through evaluating the options regarding the communication with the survivors and
wait a minute, evaluating the operation? I think you need to get to the task at hand. Evaluating.
What I said was we're evaluating what we'll offer to them and how we'll communicate with them regarding the oversharing of data.
I think this needs to be expedited.
I hear you loud and clear, Mr. Chairman.
You know, I mean, how do you know people's identities haven't been stolen?
We have no evidence that they have been, but I can't.
You don't have any evidence that they haven't?
I cannot say that they have not been.
And you haven't on either side, right? And you have no evidence that they haven't been, correct?
Correct.
So please, let me, OIG, please, I know.
So since we made the discovery, and it was our staff who, meeting with FEMA initially, looking at the records they had on survivors, it was our staff who realized there was personally identifiable information that was not required for the administration of the program. Our staff then met with the contractor and verified that, yes, the contractor had received that unnecessary PII. So as to moving forward, our recommendations are twofold. One, clean up the incident at hand and take the steps necessary. And Mr. Kamoya is right about the steps that FEMA has initiated to assess essentially the extent of the damage. It's true that there's been no evidence that PII has gotten past the contractor out into the public or what have you. The concern is when from our understanding and information shared with us, the contractor only kept basically the past 30 days worth of information on its system that would have shown any vulnerabilities. Prior to that, we don't know. We don't know if their system perhaps was infiltrated and if that information went anywhere. So that is of a concern, but I'm sure FEMA remains diligent in addressing it. The other issue is making sure this doesn't happen again.
I hope so.
Our other recommendation.
Ms. Mock.
So we are reviewing all of our data sharing agreements with all of our programs that share sensitive information and the contractors with whom that information is shared so that we make sure the cybersecurity safeguards are in place and the data sharing agreements are in place to protect the information. Because we know that survivors not only expect us to deliver the care that they need after a disaster, but they expect us to protect their information as well.
Well, I hope that FEMA has the urgency that I feel that this needs to be rectified. You know, I mean, being a kind of, a matter of fact about it, this is serious. This is frightening. Well, lend me your Social Security number and your bank records for me to hold on to. I mean, let me just hold it.
We agree with you with the seriousness of it, and we agree with you on the urgency.
It's 2.3 million people's information.
I agree.
It's absolutely unacceptable. I'm sorry I've gone over, but I felt that had to be borne out. No? Mr. No. No?
Just very quickly.
Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kamoy, I was troubled by your comment that you don't see systemic problems. I think, or that your question about whether systemic problems with contracting exists. And I want to speak specifically to a systemic problem that I see, which is the contracting workforce. And I appreciate Ms. Mack's comments about needing an in-depth study for the workforce needs. I noted that you said in your opening statement that there were some gains that had been made in your contracting workforce, but based on the information I have, you're still a third understaffed, and you've actually lost staff since 2017. So I appreciated your agreement that we do need that in-depth study. When can we expect to see that in-depth study?
Let me be clear, Chairwoman Torres-Small. In response to Congresswoman Titus's question about whether the cancellation for non-performance of 4 contracts represented a systemic problem, I don't know if it does. That does not mean I don't see systemic opportunities to improve our contracting process. It's what we've been doing. I was simply citing the 4 terminations for non-performance. It is a challenge to recruit and retain 1102 contracting specialists in the federal government.
And Mr. Kamoy, I apologize. The question was just when can we expect to see this study?
I believe I believe the completion date that we estimated to the GAO recommendation was in August, but I'll follow up with a more specific date. Sorry, I just don't remember the exact date. But we've already committed to a date, and we'll provide that to you.
Thank you. And you're re-upping that commitment to the date?
Absolutely.
When thank you. I yield my time.
And I'm sorry I didn't remember the date.
I yield my time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to ask unanimous consent for the Center for a New Economy's report on the federal contracting in the post-disaster period be entered into the record. Assuming no objections, without objections, so ordered. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, the committee records shall be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, this subcommittee stands adjourned.